It's a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that fills the air with the scent of fallen leaves. In a quiet neighborhood, Jacob, a young boy with an adventurous spirit, rides his bike down a winding path. The golden light filters through the trees, casting a warm glow on everything it touches. It's the kind of day where nothing seems out of the ordinary, until a sudden movement catches Jacob's eye. By the side of the path, a small squirrel lies sprawled on the ground, barely moving. Its tiny chest rises and falls erratically, its fur matted with dirt. Jacob skids to a stop, his heart pounding. He's no stranger to squirrels darting across his path, but this one isn't running. Instead, it seems to be clinging to life, its eyes half closed. Jacob drops his bike and crouches beside the animal. His hands tremble as he gently scoops it into his palms, careful not to startle it. The squirrel doesn't resist, too weak to move. "You're hurt," Jacob whispers, his voice soft. He looks around, unsure of what to do. His usual adventures never prepared him for something like this. A few houses away, Jacob's neighbor, Mrs. Carter, notices him kneeling by the path. She's a retired teacher, known for her gentle nature and her love of animals. "Jacob," she calls out, approaching with concern. "What's going on?" Jacob looks up, his face pale. "It's a squirrel. It's hurt really bad. I don't know what to do." Mrs. Carter leans down, her kind eyes scanning the small creature in Jacob's hands. "We need to get it help," she says firmly. "There's a veterinary clinic in town. They'll know what to do." The two move quickly, with Mrs. Carter driving and Jacob cradling the squirrel in the back seat. The ride feels longer than it is, every passing second heightening Jacob's anxiety. The squirrel's shallow breathing fills the silence, a fragile reminder of its dire state. When they arrive at the clinic, the receptionist ushers them in immediately. "We'll take it from here," she says, her voice reassuring. But Jacob hesitates, reluctant to let go. The squirrel, though small and frail, feels like a responsibility he never expected. A veterinarian steps into the room, her presence calm yet commanding. Dr. Harper, a woman with a soft voice and steady hands, crouches to Jacob's level. "You did a brave thing bringing this little one here," she says, her warm smile putting him at ease. "Let's see what's going on." As Dr. Harper takes the squirrel, Jacob's heart aches with worry. Mrs. Carter rests a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've done all you can," she says. "Now it's up to them." Dr. Harper disappears into the examination room, leaving Jacob and Mrs. Carter to wait. The minutes drag on, each one heavier than the last. Jacob's mind races with questions. Will the squirrel be okay? Did he do enough? Could he have acted sooner? The clinic feels sterile and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the warm autumn day outside. Jacob's fingers fidget with the hem of his shirt, his gaze fixed on the door to the examination room. He can't shake the feeling that this squirrel, small and vulnerable, was meant to cross his path for a reason. When Dr. Harper finally returns, her expression is serious yet gentle. "We've stabilized him," she says, holding Jacob's gaze. "But there's something you need to know." Her words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Jacob leans forward, his heart pounding. He has no idea what she's about to say, but he knows it will change everything. Dr. Harper knelt beside Jacob, the squirrel resting carefully in her gloved hands. Its tiny body was wrapped in a soft towel, and though its breathing was steadier, it still seemed fragile. Jacob stared at it, his eyes wide with worry. "He's lucky you found him," Dr. Harper began, her voice calm yet serious. "But there's something unusual about this little one." She placed the squirrel gently in a small enclosure on the examination table, and motioned for Jacob to follow her. Jacob hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Carter, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Go on, Jacob," she said softly. "You've come this far." Dr. Harper led Jacob to a back room filled with medical charts and diagrams. She pointed to an X-ray displayed on a monitor. "This is your squirrel," she explained, tapping the image. Jacob's eyes widened as he took in the delicate skeleton on the screen. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Harper leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed. "He has a broken leg, likely from a fall. That's what caused him to collapse. But there's more. This isn't just any squirrel." She paused, letting the words sink in. "He's a rare species, one that's protected." Jacob blinked, unsure of what that meant. "Protected?" he echoed. Dr. Harper nodded. "This type of squirrel is incredibly rare in our region. They're often studied for their unique behavior and adaptability, but unfortunately, their numbers have been declining. This little one is part of a species we're trying hard to conserve." Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. "Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Harper smiled gently. "We've set his leg, and he's stable for now, but he'll need time to recover. More importantly, he'll need to be cared for properly to make sure he can survive in the wild." Mrs. Carter, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. "What kind of care does he need?" Dr. Harper folded her arms, her expression thoughtful. "He'll need a controlled environment, plenty of rest, and a specific diet to regain his strength. Normally, we'd send him to a wildlife rehabilitation center, but those are overwhelmed right now. There's a chance—" She glanced at Jacob, her smile returning. "There's a chance you could help." Jacob's jaw dropped. "Me? Take care of him?" Dr. Harper crouched to his level, her voice warm but firm. "You've already proven how much you care about him. With my guidance, you could help him recover until he's ready to go back to the wild." Jacob's heart raced. The idea of taking care of the squirrel was both thrilling and terrifying. He looked at Mrs. Carter, who smiled kindly. "You've got a big heart, Jacob," she said. "If anyone can do it, you can." "But I don't know anything about squirrels," Jacob protested. "That's where I come in," Dr. Harper said. "I'll teach you everything you need to know. It won't be easy, but I think you're up for the challenge." Jacob glanced back at the squirrel, still resting in its enclosure. Its tiny chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, and for the first time, Jacob saw a spark of hope in its fragile form. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Dr. Harper's smile widened. "Good. We'll get you started with the basics today, but first, there's one more thing you should know." Jacob frowned, his nerves returning. "What is it?" Dr. Harper's tone grew serious. "This squirrel isn't just rare. It's essential to the balance of the ecosystem in this area. Helping him isn't just about saving one animal. It's about protecting an entire species." Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. He wasn't just helping a small, injured creature. He was stepping into a role much larger than himself, a responsibility that could make a real difference. As the rain outside gave way to a soft drizzle, Jacob felt a mixture of fear and determination. He had found the squirrel by chance, but now he realized it wasn't chance at all. It was a call to action, one he couldn't ignore. The ride back home was quieter than the trip to the clinic. Jacob sat in the back seat of Mrs. Carter's car, the small carrier holding the squirrel resting on his lap. The air was filled with the faint scent of cedar bedding, which Dr. Harper had provided along with instructions for Jacob's first few days of care. "You're awfully quiet," Mrs. Carter remarked gently as she glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Are you nervous?" Jacob nodded, his hands gripping the carrier tightly. What if I mess it up? What if I can't do this? Mrs. Carter smiled, her voice soothing. You'll have help, Jacob. Dr. Harper will guide you, and I'm just a few houses away if you need anything. You've already done something amazing by saving this little one. That shows you've got what it takes. Her words were comforting, but Jacob's thoughts were still tangled with doubts. When they arrived at his house, his mom met them at the door, her face a mixture of concern and pride as Mrs. Carter explained the situation. You're really taking on something big, his mom said, kneeling to Jacob's level. But I'm proud of you. We'll make this work together. Inside, they set up the enclosure in a quiet corner of the living room, away from the noise and activity of the house. Dr. Harper had given Jacob detailed instructions, a mix of specific foods, limited handling to allow the squirrel to rest, and daily updates to the clinic to monitor its progress. Jacob crouched beside the enclosure, watching the squirrel as it curled up in the soft bedding. It looked so small and vulnerable, its bandaged leg a reminder of how fragile life could be. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but with it came a sense of purpose. The first night was a challenge. Jacob stayed up late, checking on the squirrel every hour, afraid it might need something he didn't know how to provide. His mom found him asleep next to the enclosure the next morning, his head resting on his crossed arms. You're really taking this seriously, aren't you? She said with a smile, ruffling his hair. Jacob rubbed his eyes, yawning. I don't want anything to happen to him. Dr. Harper called later that morning to check in. How's our little patient? She asked. Jacob straightened up, trying to sound confident. He's okay, I think. He's been eating a little and sleeping a lot. That's exactly what he needs, Dr. Harper said. Remember, this is a team effort. You're doing great. Over the next few days, Jacob's routine transformed. He carefully prepared the squirrel's meals, a mix of nuts, seeds, and fresh greens, as Dr. Harper had instructed. He monitored the squirrel's progress, noting when it became more active and started exploring its enclosure. Each small improvement felt like a victory, filling Jacob with a pride he'd never experienced before. Word spread quickly among Jacob's classmates and neighbors about his unusual new responsibility. Kids from school asked him questions during recess, their curiosity piqued by the idea of helping a rare and endangered animal. Even adults in the neighborhood stopped to chat with Mrs. Carter, their admiration for Jacob growing with every retelling of his story. Despite the attention, Jacob stayed focused. Every evening, he sat beside the enclosure with his homework, keeping the squirrel company as it regained its strength. Slowly but surely, the animal's personality began to shine through. It chirped softly when it saw Jacob approach, and it started to climb the small branches in its enclosure, testing its mended leg. One evening, as Jacob sat quietly, the squirrel leapt onto the highest branch for the first time. It wobbled slightly but held its balance, looking around as if to say, I'm ready. Jacob's heart swelled with pride. You're getting better, he whispered. You're going to be okay. Dr. Harper came by for a follow-up visit later that week. She examined the squirrel carefully, nodding with approval. You've done an incredible job, Jacob, she said. He's well on his way to recovery. In a few more weeks, he'll be ready to go back to the wild. Jacob felt a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a pang of sadness at the thought of letting the squirrel go. Will he be okay out there? He asked. Dr. Harper smiled. He'll have the best chance because of you, and who knows? Maybe he'll stick around the neighborhood. Squirrels have a way of remembering the people who help them. As she left, Jacob watched the squirrel climb again, its movements more confident with each passing day. He realized that saving the squirrel wasn't just about helping an animal. It was about learning responsibility, compassion, and the power of small acts to make a big difference. The days passed quickly, each one bringing new milestones for the squirrel's recovery. Its once timid and fragile demeanor had been replaced by a lively energy. It climbed the branches in its enclosure with ease, its once injured leg moving almost as though it had never been broken. Jacob watched the transformation with pride, but also a growing ache in his chest. He knew the day was coming when the squirrel would be ready to return to the wild. Dr. Harper had warned him about this moment, but knowing it was inevitable didn't make it any easier. "You've done something amazing, Jacob," Mrs. Carter said one evening as she joined him on the porch. The squirrel had taken to spending time outside in a larger, open enclosure during the day, getting used to the sights and sounds of nature again. "You gave him a second chance." Jacob nodded, his eyes fixed on the squirrel as it darted up and down a branch, its bushy tail flicking in excitement. But what if he's not ready? What if something happens to him out there? Mrs. Carter smiled gently. "That's part of letting go. You've done everything you can to prepare him, but now it's up to him. And nature is full of surprises. He's stronger than you think." Dr. Harper stopped by a few days later to assess the squirrel's readiness for release. She knelt beside Jacob, watching as the squirrel explored its enclosure. "He's ready," she said softly, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've given him the tools he needs to survive. Now it's time to let him do what he was meant to do." Jacob swallowed hard, the words hitting him harder than he expected. "Can I still check on him after he's gone?" Dr. Harper smiled. "Of course. Animals like him often stick close to where they've been cared for. He'll remember you, Jacob. You've been a big part of his journey." That night, Jacob sat beside the enclosure for hours, talking softly to the squirrel as it rested on a branch. "You're going to be okay out there," he whispered. "You're strong, and you'll figure it out. Just don't forget me, okay?" The next morning, the neighborhood gathered at a nearby park to witness the release. Word of Jacob's dedication had spread, and people came to show their support. Children from his class cheered him on, their admiration shining brightly in their eyes. Mrs. Carter stood nearby, her warm smile encouraging him as he opened the enclosure's door. The squirrel hesitated for a moment, its tiny body poised at the threshold. Then, with a flick of its tail, it leapt out, bounding toward a tree. The crowd erupted into applause as the squirrel climbed higher and higher, finally settling on a sturdy branch. Jacob watched with a mixture of joy and sadness, his heart heavy but full. The squirrel looked down at him one last time, its bright eyes meeting his before it scampered off into the canopy. Dr. Harper placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You did it," she said. "Because of you, he has a second chance at life." Jacob nodded, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. "It feels good," he admitted, "but it's hard to say goodbye." "That's what makes it special," Dr. Harper said. "You cared enough to let him go." The crowd began to disperse, but Jacob lingered beneath the tree, his gaze fixed on the spot where the squirrel had disappeared. Mrs. Carter joined him, her voice soft. "He'll be okay, Jacob, and so will you." For the first time in days, Jacob felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do, and though the journey had been challenging, it had also been rewarding in ways he never imagined. As they walked home, Jacob glanced back at the park one last time. In his heart, he knew this wasn't the end. The squirrel might have left, but the lessons Jacob had learned and the bond they had shared would stay with him forever. The days after the squirrel's release felt quieter than usual. Jacob found himself glancing at the tree line every now and then, hoping for a glimpse of the small creature he had cared for. Though he missed the squirrel, there was a sense of fulfillment in knowing he had done everything he could to help it thrive. Mrs. Carter stopped by one afternoon, carrying a small gift box. "For you," she said, handing it to Jacob with a kind smile. Inside was a notebook and a pen. "To write about your adventure," she explained. "It's not every day a boy helps save a rare animal." Jacob smiled as he flipped through the blank pages. "Thanks, Mrs. Carter, I think I will." Over the next few weeks, Jacob poured his thoughts into the notebook, chronicling every detail of his journey, from finding the injured squirrel to the moment he set it free. Writing helped him process the experience, and as the pages filled, he realized how much he had learned about responsibility, patience, and compassion. One crisp morning, Jacob decided to visit the park where he had released the squirrel. He brought a few walnuts, hoping against hope that his furry friend might appear. As he approached the tree where the squirrel had disappeared, he heard a familiar rustle in the branches above. Looking up, he saw a small figure darting along the branches. Jacob's heart leapt as the squirrel paused, its bright eyes locking onto his. It chirped once, its tail flicking in recognition. Jacob grinned, holding up a walnut as the squirrel descended cautiously. It didn't take long for the squirrel to snatch the nut and retreat back to the safety of the branches. Jacob laughed, his chest swelling with joy. "You didn't forget," he whispered. "I knew you wouldn't." The moment felt like a gift, a small but profound reminder of the bond they had shared. Jacob watched as the squirrel scampered off, disappearing once more into the canopy. He didn't need it to stay. Knowing it was thriving was enough. When Jacob returned home, he told his mom and Mrs. Carter about the encounter. "He's doing great," Jacob said, his face glowing. "It feels good to see him out there, living his life." Dr. Harper called later that evening to check in. When Jacob told her about seeing the squirrel, she chuckled warmly. "They have a way of remembering the people who help them," she said. "You made a difference, Jacob. Never forget that." Jacob's story soon became the talk of the town. His classmates asked him to share it during show and tell, and even the local paper ran a small article about his efforts. But for Jacob, the real reward wasn't the attention. It was knowing that he had played a part in something much bigger than himself. As the seasons changed and autumn gave way to winter, Jacob often thought about the squirrel and the journey they had shared. It had started as a chance encounter, but it had taught him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. One snowy afternoon, Jacob sat by the window, watching the frost form delicate patterns on the glass. He thought about how much he had grown over the past few months. The experience had taught him not just about animals, but about himself, about the power of kindness, the importance of persistence, and the incredible impact of even the smallest actions. Mrs. Carter's voice broke his thoughts as she called from the porch. "Jacob, come see this." He rushed outside, the cold air biting his cheeks. Perched on the fence was the squirrel, its fur fluffed against the chill. It chirped softly, almost as if saying thank you, before bounding back toward the trees. Jacob smiled, his heart warm despite the cold. "That's your friend," Mrs. Carter said, her voice full of admiration. "He'll always remember what you did for him." Jacob nodded, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure. "And I'll always remember him." As he turned to go back inside, Jacob felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The squirrel's visit was a reminder that even though their paths had diverged, the connection they shared would remain. It wasn't about holding on, it was about letting go with love and trust. If this heartwarming story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe. let's celebrate the power of kindness and the incredible bonds we can share with nature.